All right, get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into the world of semaglutide. You guys have sent us a ton of stuff on this, articles, studies, even a whole Wikipedia page. It's clear you're as interested in this medication as we are.
Yeah, semaglutide seems to be everywhere we look these days, and for good reason. We don't often see a drug originally meant for one thing become so impactful in a whole other area.
It's like the overachiever of the pharmaceutical world, right?
Yeah.
So, for those who haven't heard all the buzz, let's break it down. Semaglutide, it's for type 2 diabetes, but now it's making headlines as a weight loss treatment. Am I right?
You got it. And what's really interesting is that it works by mimicking a hormone your body naturally produces called GLP-1, which helps regulate your blood sugar. Scientists discovered that by tweaking semaglutide's structure a bit, they could make it last way longer in the body.
So they basically took this natural hormone and gave it superpowers. But why is this long-lasting effect so important?
Well, think about it this way. Instead of needing daily injections, with semaglutide you only need one a week, and it stays active that whole time. That's a game changer for people who struggle with remembering daily medications.
That makes a huge difference for so many people. Okay, so it's a long-lasting GLP-1 mimic, but how does that translate into helping with both blood sugar and weight? It's like this one drug is doing double duty.
Exactly. And it tackles both in a very elegant way. Let's start with blood sugar. Semaglutide acts just like natural GLP-1, telling your pancreas to release insulin when blood sugar is high, and putting the brakes on another hormone, glucagon, that raises blood sugar.
So it's like fine-tuning your body's natural system for controlling blood sugar.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even more interesting. That same mechanism also plays a role in weight management. See, semaglutide slows down how quickly your stomach empties, so you feel fuller for longer. That means less snacking and fewer cravings because your body's actually satisfied.
Okay, so less of that hangry feeling that can lead to unhealthy choices makes sense. But I've also read that it might actually be affecting our brains. Is there any truth to that?
You're right on the money. That's a huge area of research right now. There are studies that suggest semaglutide might be impacting the parts of our brain related to reward and maybe even addiction, almost like it's hitting the off switch for certain cravings.
Wow, are you serious? That's incredible. Are there any specific examples of how this might be playing out in people?
Well, it's still early days and more research is being done, but some promising research on its effect on alcohol cravings has come out. It seems like for some people, semaglutide actually makes them want to drink less, which has scientists really excited about what this could mean for treating addiction.
That is fascinating. Talk about an unexpected benefit. Okay, so we've got a drug that's basically a supercharged version of a natural hormone, and it's showing promise in tackling two major health issues, diabetes and obesity. But I'm guessing this wasn't an overnight success story.
You're right. Developing any kind of new drug is a long and rigorous process, especially one with this much potential impact.
So let's rewind a bit. What's the story here? When was semaglutide first approved, and what for?
The initial focus was all on its potential for type 2 diabetes. Those early trials were super promising, which led to the FDA's approval of semaglutide under the brand name Ozempic back in 2017.
2017, okay, so fairly recently. But then how did we go from diabetes treatment to all this talk about weight loss? How was that connection even discovered?
It's a great example of how scientific discoveries often happen by accident, honestly. As researchers were studying semaglutide for diabetes, they started noticing something interesting in their data. The people taking it were losing weight, and not just we're talking clinically significant weight loss.
Uh-huh, the light bulb moment. So then what happened? Did they start new trials specifically for weight loss?
They did, and not just small studies either. Some of these, like the STEP trials you might have seen in the research you sent us, involved thousands of people all over the world.
The STEP trials, yes. Those are the ones specifically designed to test semaglutide for weight loss, right?
Yeah.
Not just as a side effect of the diabetes treatment.
Exactly, and the results were pretty impressive. The STEP trial showed that people using semaglutide, along with making lifestyle changes, lost way more weight than those who just focused on diet and exercise. This was a big deal, and ultimately it's what led to the FDA approving semaglutide, this time under the brand name Wegovy, for chronic weight management in adults back in 2021.
Wow, so in just a few years, it went from managing diabetes to a potential game changer in dealing with obesity.
That's incredible. This really feels like one of those discoveries that could rewrite medical textbooks.
It really does. But of course, no medication is perfect. It has its downsides. There are some side effects, and we still need more research to fully understand what the long-term impacts of using semaglutide might be.
Right, because unfortunately, no drug is perfect.
Mm.
And I know from the research we got that some of those side effects can be pretty rough. Yeah, that's true. The most common complaints are things like nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, which are definitely not things you want to hear when you're considering a new medication.
For sure, not what you want to hear at all. But are those side effects usually temporary, at least?
The good news is that for a lot of people, those side effects are temporary and tend to go away or decrease as their body gets used to the medication.
Well, that's a relief. But I also remember reading about some concerns with more serious potential risks. Things like pancreatitis and even a type of thyroid cancer.
You're right. Those concerns are definitely out there, and it's important we talk about them. Let's start with pancreatitis. While it is listed as a possible side effect, the data is actually a bit all over the place. There was a big meta-analysis back in 2019 that didn't find a higher risk of acute pancreatitis that was specifically linked to semaglutide.
So more research is needed there for sure. What about the thyroid cancer connection? That seems a lot more alarming, especially with the FDA's boxed warning and all.
I get it. It sounds scary. The FDA does have a boxed warning on their most serious kind about the potential risk of thyroid C-cell tumors with semaglutide. But there's an important thing to remember here. That warning is based on studies done on rodents, not on humans.
So we don't actually know for sure if that risk is the same for humans.
Exactly. More research is needed to really understand the risk for us. There was some data from France a few years ago that caused some worry because it suggested a possible link between a group of drugs similar to semaglutide and thyroid cancer. But more recent data from a much larger analysis, which looked at tens of thousands of patients, suggested that semaglutide itself wasn't associated with a higher risk of any kind of cancer, even thyroid cancer, after 18 months of use.
Okay, so that's at least somewhat reassuring. But 18 months isn't exactly a long time when we're talking about something as serious as cancer. Long-term monitoring is definitely important.
You're absolutely right. It's kind of a waiting game while more research is being done, which I know can be frustrating for people who need answers, both patients and doctors.
It's like walking a tightrope between potential benefits and unknown risks. Well, that's a good place to pause for now. When we come back, let's delve into some of those real-world impacts of this medication. How is semaglutide shaking things up on a global scale? Stay tuned to find out. So we've explored the science behind semaglutide and how it works in the body, but let's shift gears now and talk about what this all means in the real world. I mean, it's one thing to discuss clinical trials and all that, but it's another to understand how this is actually playing out for people globally.
Yeah, you're right. Semaglutide's journey, so to speak, has been anything but typical. It's generated a ton of excitement, for sure, but also some real challenges, even ethical dilemmas.
One of the biggest challenges I keep seeing is the sheer demand for this drug, right? It seems like everywhere I look, there's a news story about semaglutide shortages. So what's the deal with this supply and demand issue?
Well, it's a classic example of what happens when you've got a game-changing product and a huge need in the market. I mean, here you have this drug that's showing amazing weight loss results, and we know weight loss is something a significant chunk of the population is looking for, and bam, suddenly the global supply chain is scrambling to catch up.
And we're only a few years into this whole semaglutide thing being approved for weight loss, right? It feels like this could be just the beginning in terms of how much demand there is. So what's the holdup? What are the main hurdles to making more of it to meet this need?
There are a few things at play here. First off, semaglutide isn't like popping out some simple pill, It's this complex molecule requires special facilities, specific expertise to manufacture, and really strict quality control. Trying to increase production to meet this surge in demand is a bit like, I don't know, going from baking a loaf of bread to suddenly needing to supply a whole city with pastries overnight. It takes time, it takes investment, and it takes careful planning.
Yeah, definitely not as simple as just flipping a switch and churning out pills, right? But even if we could somehow magically produce more overnight, there's this other big barrier, and that's the cost. I've seen reports about semaglutide being crazy expensive, especially here in the US.
You're right, that cost is a huge factor. In the U.S., where healthcare costs are already a burden for many, the price tag on Wegovy, which is the brand name for semaglutide when it's prescribed for weight loss, can be a real obstacle.
Right.
We're talking over $1,000 a month, which is simply not doable for a lot of people.
And then even if you have insurance, there's probably still a lot of hoops to jump through, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even with insurance coverage, there can be high copays, very specific requirements to even qualify, or those long pre-authorization processes that people have to navigate. It basically creates a system where, sadly, whether or not you can get this potentially life-changing medication often comes down to whether or not you can afford to pay for it out of pocket. And that raises some serious questions about, fairness and equity in our healthcare system.
It's true. It really does feel like it could create this kind of two-tiered system where people with more resources have an easier time accessing these medical advancements.
It's a real concern. And it's not limited to the U.S. either. Even in countries with those universal healthcare systems, where everyone's covered, they're also dealing with limited budgets and this huge demand. So we're seeing wait lists, restrictions, and really tough decisions being made about who gets prioritized for this treatment.
So we're stuck in this tough spot, right? We've got incredible potential with this scientific discovery, but then this very real challenge of actually making it accessible to everyone who needs it. It's like finding a gold mine, but then you don't have the tools to mine it, and you certainly don't have a way to distribute it fairly.
That is a perfect analogy. And as you can imagine, when you have something like this, high demand, limited supply, and it's seen as incredibly valuable, it unfortunately creates this breeding ground for, well, for lack of a better word, exploitation.
You're talking about the black market, aren't you? People turning to those unverified sources online, trying to get their hands on this medication however they can.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a trend that we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah.
Counterfeit semaglutide is popping up all over the internet, and it's being marketed to, well, to people who are desperate for a solution, people who haven't been able to access it through those traditional means.
That's got to be terrifying. I mean, with those counterfeit products, there's literally no way of knowing what's in them. People could be putting themselves at huge risk.
You're absolutely right. It's incredibly risky, and it just highlights how desperate people are to find something that actually works for weight loss. It's gotten to the point where some feel they have to take risks they probably wouldn't consider otherwise, all because the current system just isn't working for them.
It's a good point. We can get really caught up in the exciting science and those clinical trial results, but it's crucial to remember the human side of all of this. Because for many people, despite its risks and the challenges in even getting their hands on it, semaglutide represents hope. And with that hope, there's a responsibility to find solutions that are, that are safe and fair and truly accessible.
I couldn't agree more. It's a shared responsibility for all of us, researchers, healthcare providers, even policymakers, and just society as a whole, to face those complexities head on. Issues of access, affordability, and the risks that come with a drug like semaglutide.
Sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach here, for sure. We need to figure out how to make more, responsibly, of course. But we also need to address the cost, make it actually affordable, and then ensure that it's being used safely and for the right reasons.
You got it. And that actually brings us to another really critical aspect of semaglutide that we haven't touched on yet. Some of the deeper, more complex ethical considerations.
Oh. Okay, so we've covered the practical stuff like access and affordability, but what about the bigger picture? You're talking about a drug that could actually change how we experience things like hunger and cravings, right?
Exactly. We talked earlier about how semaglutide works, how it influences parts of our brain that control appetite, the reward pathways, and maybe even addiction. Well, this brings up some really profound ethical questions about something really fundamental. What does it mean to be human? And what does it mean to have free will? Because if we can just flip a switch with a medication and turn off certain cravings or desires, where do we draw the line? What happens to personal responsibility? These are questions we need to be asking ourselves right now before things go too far.
Those are some heavy questions. It's almost like we've stumbled into this whole new realm of ethics, forcing us to examine our relationship with medication, with our own brains, and just this whole idea of being in control of our own desires. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, that we might be at a point where we can actually manipulate those really basic parts of ourselves, like our desires, with just an injection. Where do we even begin to draw that line? The line between what's considered medical treatment and what's basically enhancing, maybe even altering who we are at our core.
That's the big question, isn't it? And I don't think there are any easy answers here. On the one hand, you've got the potential to use semaglutide to help people struggling with things like addiction. I mean, imagine helping someone break free from a really serious life-altering addiction, or even just manage a condition that's really impacting their quality of life. That's huge, right? But it does sort of muddy the waters, ethically speaking, in a way that we haven't really figured out how to deal with yet as a society.
It's true. It's like we're in this totally new territory ethically, and no one has the map for this. So what could go wrong, right? What are we not seeing? Are there downsides to being able to control our desires and cravings like this?
That's where it gets interesting, but also potentially a bit scary, just as a thought experiment. Imagine if parents could just decide to, I don't know, turn off their kids' chances of struggling with addiction or, like we were talking about before, even obesity, just by giving them a medication. At first, it sounds almost like science fiction, maybe even appealing in a way. But then you have to think, what does that do to individual choice? Do people have a right to make unhealthy choices? These are questions we need answers for, and fast, before we get too far ahead of ourselves.
It's a lot of responsibility to think about for individuals, but also for society as a whole. It feels bigger than just a patient and their doctor, right?
Hmm.
This could change how we view free will, choice, what it even means to be human.
Exactly. And it's not just the immediate ethical stuff that we need to be thinking about. There could be unintended consequences down the road, things we're not even considering right now. For example, let's say these appetite-suppressing medications like semaglutide become really widespread. Could that change the food industry as we know it? Could it even change our social rituals around eating? It's hard to predict.
It does make you think about that butterfly effect thing, how one little change can have these huge ripple effects. We're not just talking about individual health anymore. This has the potential to change our entire culture, our economy, even our values.
That's exactly right. And that's why I think these conversations are so important. The semaglutide is just one example of how these big scientific discoveries force us to confront these ethical and societal questions. And they're not easy ones to answer.
So, where do we go from here? How do we make sure we're approaching all of this responsibly?
Honestly, I think step one is just admitting that we don't have all the answers. We need to be having open conversations about this, not just scientists and doctors, but everyone, ethicists, policymakers, the public, everyone. We've got to look at the good, the bad, the potential benefits, and the possible risks. We have to think about individuals, but also society as a whole.
It sounds like what you're saying is we need to be more aware, more educated, and we need to be talking about this more.
Absolutely. We can't just avoid the tough questions because they're uncomfortable. And I think the biggest thing is approaching all of this with a sense of humility. We're still figuring this out as we go along. We have to be open to the idea that we might not have all the answers right now.
That's a good point. A little reminder that progress isn't always straightforward. There are going to be bumps in the road. So it sounds like there's a lot more to this semaglutide story than meets the eye. Are there other potential uses for it that we haven't even touched on yet?
You're right, there's a lot more to it. And while we focused on things like diabetes, obesity, and addiction, the research is now branching out into other areas too.
Really? Come on, tell me more. What else is semaglutide being looked at for?
Okay, so researchers are now looking into its potential for things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even certain cancers. It's really interesting to see what they're discovering about GLP-1 receptor agonists like semaglutide.
It's wild to think that this one medication, which started out as a way to treat diabetes, might end up being the key to all sorts of other treatments for all kinds of conditions. It just shows you the power of science and why we've got to keep asking questions.
It really does. And honestly, I think that's what I find so fascinating about semaglutide. It's a story about these amazing scientific breakthroughs, for sure, but it's also a story about how complex our biology is and how challenging healthcare can be, the costs, accessibility, and those big ethical questions we have to face as we learn more about how to treat ourselves, how to potentially change ourselves. It's a lot to unpack.
It has been a wild ride, this deep dive. I'm definitely leaving with a sense of awe at what science can do, but also this feeling that we really need to think carefully about the choices we're making as we go further down this road.
I agree. It's awe-inspiring, but also a bit daunting at the same time.
Hmm.
And maybe that's the most important thing to take away from all of this, that as we make these amazing scientific discoveries, we have to be cautious, we have to be curious, and we have to keep asking the tough questions. We can't just assume we're doing the right thing. We have to make sure of it.
Well said. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of semaglutide. Listeners, we hope this has sparked some questions and maybe even inspired you to do a little digging of your own. What will your deep dive uncover?
The future of medicine is full of possibilities, but it comes with a lot of responsibility too.
That's for sure. Thanks for joining us today, everyone, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive into the world of science, health, and what it means to be human. Until then, take care.